Imagine living in a place where, beneath your feet, buried under the floor where your children sleep and your fire burns, lie the severed skulls of your own family. Not by accident, but by design, placed there with purpose, arranged, preserved, and hidden in the very soil that holds up your shelter. This isn't some horror movie script or ancient myth. This was real. And for a long time, archaeologists had no idea why. In the hills of modern-day Turkey, beneath a crumbling Neolithic settlement, researchers made a discovery that even hardened scientists found disturbing. While excavating what seemed like an ordinary prehistoric home, they hit bone. But it wasn't animal bone. It was human. And not just a body carelessly thrown into the earth, but a skull, carefully cleaned, stripped of flesh, and placed under the foundation stones of a sleeping area. At first, they thought it was a burial. Maybe an elder, maybe a tragic death. But then they found another skull, and another, until the pattern was impossible to ignore. Multiple homes in this ancient village had skulls buried beneath them, each one showing signs of deliberate removal and preservation. And always the skull, never the full body. Then came the next twist. Some of the skulls were painted red. Others had holes drilled into them, as if to hang them or wear them. A few had been reburied multiple times, unearthed, and moved to new locations. These weren't graves. These were rituals. And the people who did it? They weren't monsters or savages. They were us, just older, more desperate, maybe more honest about what fear, death, and memory really meant. But here's the question that still haunts researchers today. Why did they do it? Was it to keep their dead close? To harness power from the bones? Or was there something darker? Some secret these early humans knew that we've forgotten? Because as archaeologists dug deeper into sites like Çatalhöyük in Jericho, they realized this wasn't an isolated practice. From the Middle East to Eastern Europe, across thousands of years, cultures were removing heads, burying skulls, painting them, decorating them, and always hiding them beneath the home. And in many of these sites, the skulls belonged to children. You're about to hear one of the darkest, most fascinating stories in early human history. A story buried in ritual, soaked in blood memory, and painted in the color of sacrifice. This is the real reason skulls were placed beneath the homes of our ancestors. And once you understand it, you may never look at the ground beneath your feet the same way again. To understand the meaning behind these skull burials, we have to go back nearly 9,000 years to one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites on Earth, Çatalhöyük, located in modern-day Turkey. This was no simple cave or a tribal camp. Çatalhöyük was a massive, organized prehistoric settlement, one of the world's first known cities. With over 8,000 people living in tightly packed mud brick homes, no streets, and ladders leading to rooftops, it looked more like a maze than a village. But what made this place truly bizarre wasn't just its layout. It was what was found beneath the homes. As archaeologists excavated layer after layer of compacted mud brick, they discovered that nearly every home was built on top of the dead. Bodies were intentionally buried beneath the floors, and not just random bodies. They were selected, carefully positioned. Often, the rest of the body was missing, and only the skull remained. Some skulls were cradled in bowls. Others were found stacked near hearths. In a few homes, multiple skulls were grouped together beneath sleeping platforms, as if the living were resting directly above the dead. And this wasn't a rare occurrence. In Çatalhöyük alone, over 400 skulls were discovered under homes. But here's where it gets darker. Many of these skulls had been removed from already buried bodies, dug up, detached, then painted in red ochre, a pigment associated with blood and life force in ancient ritual. Some skulls had small holes drilled through the top, suggesting they were hung or worn like talismans. A few even had traces of plaster, molded to recreate facial features, like prehistoric death masks. In other words, these weren't just burials. They were acts of memory, of reverence, or control. You might ask, how do we know they weren't simply honoring ancestors? Well, that's the mystery. In many cases, the skulls weren't from elders or important tribe leaders. Some were children. Others showed blunt force trauma, signs of violent death, or even execution. And in one of the most chilling discoveries, a child's skull was found painted and placed alone beneath the home's main room, without any accompanying body. No ceremony, no grave goods, just a single skull in the dirt, its jaw missing, its eye sockets empty. Archaeologist Ian Hodder, one of the leading researchers at Çatalhöyük, described the site as a place where the boundary between life and death was fluid, where the dead were not gone, but integrated into daily life. People cooked, slept, and made love above buried skulls. Children learned to walk, just feet above the heads of ancestors, or victims. And Çatalhöyük wasn't alone. Across the Levant, similar practices emerged. In Jericho, one of the world's oldest fortified cities, archaeologists discovered a cache of human skulls that had been plastered over, faces rebuilt with clay, seashells placed into the eye sockets. These skulls were displayed inside homes, possibly worshipped or feared. Some were buried and later retrieved, passed down, or reburied again. They weren't just mementos. They were power objects, which leads us to a chilling theory. In these early societies, skulls may have been seen as containers, not of memory, but of energy, of spiritual force. Some anthropologists believe that early humans thought the skull held the soul, the essence of life. And by keeping the skull, they were controlling the spirit of the dead, either as protection, reverence, or domination. There are even more unsettling interpretations. In some sites, child skulls are found buried alone, or near doorways, suggesting they were used as house guardians. In others, the heads of enemies may have been taken as trophies, buried under floors not to honor them, but to trap them, to keep their power subjugated beneath the home. In essence, the floor became a battlefield, a boundary, a prison. It's no wonder that the act of burying skulls beneath homes has been called domestic necromancy, the mingling of the living and the dead in intimate, daily ritual. And still, the question looms. Were these skulls from loved ones or sacrifices? Because in some cases, there's no evidence of family relation, no signs of mourning, only the skulls, separated from bodies, altered and arranged. And some buried homes contained only child skulls. That detail, repeated across multiple sites, hints at something darker, something ritualistic, maybe even religious. Were the children buried under homes to protect the living, or to appease something else? The deeper we dig into these ancient sites, the clearer one truth becomes. The people of the early world did not see death the way we do. It wasn't distant. It wasn't buried in graveyards. It was under their feet, inside their homes, stitched into their lives. But what happens when a society makes death part of the architecture? What happens when the floor beneath you is built on skulls? That's where the final twist comes in. Because recent discoveries in these skull-rich settlements reveal something even stranger, something that turns this story from disturbing to possibly terrifying. And that's exactly what we'll explore next. For years, archaeologists believe these skulls, plastered, painted, and buried under Neolithic homes, represented reverence, remembrance, maybe even love. But that theory began to fracture when researchers noticed something deeply unsettling in the placement patterns, something that didn't feel ceremonial, it felt strategic. In several homes, the skulls weren't buried in the corners, where we might place a sacred item. They weren't placed under altars or communal spaces. Instead, many were buried directly beneath sleeping platforms, and in some cases, beneath the threshold of the doorway, a space where people stepped every single day. It was as if the skulls were meant to be stepped on, slept on, lived on, almost like they were being suppressed, not honored. And then came the real twist. In some dwellings, researchers found bite marks on the skulls. Not from animals, from humans. The marks were faint, but unmistakable, teeth scraping bone, molars crushing through orbital sockets. These weren't ceremonial cleansings. These were acts of consumption. This changed everything. What if the skulls weren't just buried after death? What if the death was part of the ritual? What if the act of eating, of consuming the dead, especially children, was the point? We know from ethnographic records that many ancient societies, from Papua New Guinea to Mesoamerica, practiced ritual cannibalism, not as an act of survival, but as a gateway. a way to absorb the power of the dead, to bind the spirit to the living, and to neutralize fear by turning death into a meal. Now take that concept back 9,000 years, to a time when famine was frequent, mortality was high, and the line between ritual and necessity was razor thin. Imagine a family, starving through the winter. A child dies, maybe from illness, maybe something worse. The family, desperate, does what their ancestors have always done. They consume, not out of cruelty, but out of belief. They bury the skull beneath their home, not to remember the child, but to anchor them there, to keep their spirit in the house, to ensure that no matter what happens, that energy stays close. Some cultures believed this gave protection. Others feared that if the skull wasn't buried properly, the spirit would wander, angry and vengeful. But either way, the head, the skull, was the vessel. Which brings us to a chilling realization. These ancient humans may have believed that the soul lives in the skull, that by keeping it underfoot, they weren't just honoring the dead, they were controlling them. And this practice wasn't rare. Across dozens of Neolithic sites, from Çatalhöyük to Tel Aswad, from Jericho to Ain Ghazal, skull cults existed, independent of each other, spread across thousands of miles, yet all engaging in ritual skull removal, modification, and burial. It wasn't just one culture. It was a pattern of belief. It was a worldview. A system where death was not the end, but a tool. A way to shape the future through the remains of the past. And if that meant using your child's skull to guard your threshold, so be it. But it gets darker. Because in some of the skulls unearthed beneath these ancient homes, the eyes had been carved out. Not just rotted away, but intentionally gouged. The sockets had been reshaped, hollowed deeper, and in some cases, painted shut. Now ask yourself, what kind of belief would require you to erase the gaze of the dead? Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it something older, more primal, a need to silence the witness? Psychologists today talk about intergenerational trauma, the way pain, abuse, and fear echo through generations. But what if trauma was once ritualized? What if the very foundations of the homes our ancestors built were literally made from guilt, grief, and horror? Because make no mistake, these weren't acts of barbarism. They were acts of belief. And belief, as we've seen across all of human history, is often far more terrifying than instinct. In these homes, skulls weren't just buried. They were kept, moved, used, sometimes broken. And sometimes they weren't even dead when it happened. There's limited but chilling evidence that in some cases, skull removal occurred post-mortem within hours, suggesting that the bodies were still warm, that the ritual didn't wait, that the urgency of capturing the soul outweighed the dignity of the body. And to this day, we don't know what the children felt in those final moments. We don't know if they were chosen, or if they simply became the most vulnerable. We just know the skulls are there. Still buried, still watching. So the next time you think about cavemen as simple creatures who painted walls and hunted mammoths, remember this. They built homes on top of their dead. They carried skulls like relics. They ate their own in the name of something bigger. And they buried the truth beneath their feet. So ask yourself, would you sleep well, knowing the bones below you might still remember?